Just to start off with, I was wondering, we've heard very different works from a broad variety of composers tonight, and you mentioned the influence of the Paris Conservatoire and the way in which Ravel was at one point pushing the boundaries of writing for the oboe. In general, did different national schools of oboe playing inform the way that composers wrote for the instrument?
Yes, I think that's a very interesting question because in the 20th century especially, more so than on other instruments, the technique involved in playing the instrument and the way the instruments were made differed wildly from country to country. So the English oboe sound throughout most of the 20th century is sort of characterized by being quite sort of reedy. With that comes a sort of a lyricism, but then also a sort of sharpness to it as well, whereas the German oboe school was much more about roundness of sound, fullness of sound, but with that came a sort of maybe a dulling of the quality. And then the French school was sort of somewhere in between. And then most interestingly of all, the American school there was one very influential player called Tabuteau who moved from France to America and it effectively founded the American school of oboe playing. And he had a sort of muscular problem in his face, which meant he couldn't form your standard oboe embouchure that European oboists would use. So he devised a whole new way of playing on a much different reed. He scraped his reed completely differently. And through that one player, the whole American oboe school of playing was informed. And even to this day, Americans do their reeds in the same way. They play on different instruments. An American could never get a job in Europe, and a European could never get a job in America because the sound is just too different on the instrument. And so in answer to your question about composers writing for those specific schools, I think that's definitely true.
We covered the sort of Baroque to Renaissance era. Monteverdi, I guess, is the transition between those eras, the classical era and late Romanticism. Do you find the parallels in every era? And I even wonder, what would you say about the 21st century?
We only looked at 3 today because we only had time, but there are some really, really fascinating moments. You're right. There are these sort of touchstone people like Beethoven or people in the arts, in music, which we can really see a big change. Sometimes they're real forerunners, and it takes a little while for other arts to play catch up. But it's not long after, and I mean, for instance, the sort of advent of tonality actually is well, tonality as we understand it, using thirds and sixths, sort of the tonal scale, as opposed to harmony, sort of bare open fifths and fourths. This was actually a English invention. It was known as the English countenance by John Dunstable, who's pretty much right at the beginning of 1400s. And this is exactly the time that Brunelleschi in Florence develops perspective, the idea of one-point perspective. And then this completely revolutionizes art, because all of a sudden we're not just sort of people floating around in space, they're actually relative to the distance they are in the pictorial space. And almost immediately from John Dunstable onwards, we also have an idea of tonality. We have an idea of thirds, using like high major thirds or minor thirds, and we enter a whole new world. And then from that point on, you're either using tonality or deliberately subverting it, or similarly either using one-point perspective, or you're deliberately subverting it. So I think it's really fascinating. I think that this is throughout art, throughout music, there are these moments, and I think I would like to say that at any point in history. In Western history, you could find these parallels.
Ooh, we've just said, what is the etymology of the name oboe? Is it from oboe, I assume, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it comes from the French hautbois, which means high wood. And actually, in English, it used to be called hautboys, Hautboys. And in Shakespeare's Macbeth, he actually writes in hautboys' play at certain moments. So he had in mind oboes, and it's normally when the witches come on or they go off, they're sort of heralded by a choir of oboes. So Shakespeare clearly thought the oboe was a very supernatural instrument. So he called it hautboy, and then I don't know when it became oboe. I guess a lot of sort of Norman words in English became Anglified, didn't they, over time? So maybe it was just part of that Anglification, is that a word, of various French Norman words in Britain.
And we just have some audience questions coming through now.
Okay.
I think a pattern is that people want to know what happens when you hear two notes at the same time, whether that mixes the colours. So,
okay, so it's interesting. I think that, again, that relates back to what I was saying about the oral skills exercise from when I was first studying music when I was younger. If you've got three notes, I will see three colours. So it doesn't, those notes and colours don't.
Yes, because there was a particular question that asked if you play a blue note and a yellow note, does it combine to make a green note? But that's not the case. You see both colours simultaneously. No,
exactly not.
And distinctly. So the title of this recital was, of course, Synesthesia and String Playing. And you did mention or touch upon some aspects of colour, etc. in your introductions. But do you perhaps just want to give us a quick definition of synesthesia and the particular form that you have?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm just going to go right in. I'll get
Brilliant.
Otherwise I know to free up my arms. I tend to talk with my hands as well. Maybe it's a creative thing. I don't know. Yeah. So synesthesia. I mean, people may or they may not have heard of synesthesia before. So for those of you who maybe haven't heard what synesthesia is, essentially, synesthesia is a confusion of the senses. So if we look at the origins of the word, we all know what anesthesia is. Now, anesthesia is obviously where you have no feeling, so you have no sensory feeling whatsoever. And synesthesia is the opposite. So it's a joining or coupling of senses. It's basically caused by a increased connection between different areas of the brain. And actually until fairly recently, people and scientists were not aware that that was possible, which is why synesthesia has actually got a relatively short historic background to it. But for somebody who has synesthesia, it means that, for example, the letter P might taste of candy floss, or the sound of a shattering glass might not just send shivers down your spine, but actually give you a physical sensation.